probably noticed that a lot of healthy products on the market now contain allulose or erythritol instead of sugar. Both are zero-calorie, natural sweeteners that are supposed to not spike your blood sugar and are maybe better for your health. At the same time, erythritol has been making headlines over the past few years for a potential link to cardiovascular disease, while allulose is not even permitted for use in the European Union. This is why today we're investigating everything you need to know about erythritol and allulose, how are they metabolized in your body, what the evidence actually says, and whether there is a real reason for you to worry or not. All of the resources that I'll be using are linked down in the description box below. Enough rambling, let's get right into the video. I'm going to start off with erythritol because there is a lot more to unpack here. Erythritol is a sugar alcohol similarly to xylitol and sorbitol, and it has about 70% the sweetness of sugar, so it's a little bit less sweet compared to sucrose. Erythritol can also be produced endogenously in our system as a product of the pentose phosphate pathway. We're going to talk about this specific biochemical pathway a bit later in the video. Erythritol is commercially produced with the fermentation of other sugars such as glucose, but you can also find it present in some fruits such as melons, watermelons, grapes, and also in a lot of fermented foods such as different types of cheeses and soy sauce. About 90% of the ingested erythritol is absorbed in our small intestine and goes into the bloodstream. Over there, it cannot be used for energy. This is why it has no caloric value. And then it goes over to the kidneys and is excreted with the urine. The remaining 10% reach the large intestine. Over there, it is not 100% clear if some of it is indeed metabolized by the gut microbiome and what percentage exactly then leaves your body when you go into a number 2. But for the most part, not a large amount of erythritol reaches your large intestine anyways. Erythritol and also other sugar alcohols could potentially have an osmotic effect where it leads to higher water retention in your large intestine, and then that could result in laxative effects and gastrointestinal distress. Erythritol is a lot better at this. I mean, better in a good way. It needs a higher dose to lead to these consequences compared to the other sugar alcohols because most of it, 90%, is absorbed through our small intestine. However, these laxative effects still need some consideration, and this is why the European Food and Safety Authority has defined a safe level of 0.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And if you go above that, there's no guarantee for your next experience in the toilet. To compare it with the other sweeteners I've discussed up until now on the channel, because such small amounts reach the large intestine, this is why there is not really a big discussion around gut health or none at all, since most of it is absorbed, and with all of the other sweeteners I've discussed until now, they are unabsorbed for the large part and they reach the large intestine mostly intact, which is the reason why there is such a big debate around sweeteners, other sweeteners, and gut health. Now let's look at all the evidence around erythritol. As it is expected from a sweetener, it does not have an impact on blood sugar, which is what makes it so attractive for people who suffer from diabetes or insulin resistance. Another study investigated the impact of erythritol on gut hormones such as GLP-1, cholecystokinin, peptide YY, and it found that the consumption of erythritol does lead to an increase in those gut hormones. All of these are linked to an increased satiety. You see how all of the advantages start adding up slowly. It has no caloric value, no impact on blood sugar, also leads to a release of all of these satiety hormones, so people could then be in a caloric deficit, still consume the sweet foods, and also experience the release of these satiety hormones. I am emphasizing them because yes, sugar also leads to the release of these satiety hormones if we have to compare sugar and erythritol, but not all of the sweeteners have been found to induce a release of gut hormones, and they're essential for blood sugar management and also for appetite control. Scientists suggested that the release of good hormones might be linked to the osmotic effects of erythritol, but it is not quite definite and no exact conclusion can be made on this topic. Now let's move into the more controversial topics. There have been large bodies of research gathering data from a lot of people. Those are observational studies, and they have found a link between increased blood levels of erythritol and the incidence of a lot of metabolic conditions such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and an increased amount of visceral fat. This is the fat that is pro-inflammatory and is around your organs and has also been linked to the development of cardiovascular disease. These specific papers, at least the largest, one of the largest of those, are partially problematic, especially if you want to link them to the consumption of erythritol, the sweetener, because for one of them, data was gathered before erythritol was even being sold or permitted as a sweetener in the US. So then when would all of this erythritol in the blood be coming from? This is when we're moving back to the pentose phosphate pathway that I mentioned in the beginning of the video. This pentose phosphate pathway is more active when there's also more glycolysis happening. Glycolysis is the process where sugar is being utilized for energy. It is converted into adenosine triphosphate, ATP, our main energy source. And you can imagine that if there are more sugars circulating in the blood, then there would be more glycolysis happening and more of the pentose phosphate pathway happening. And when do we have more sugar in the blood? Either when there's an impaired glucose metabolism in our body, so we're suffering from some type of insulin resistance, or maybe when we are having the Western type of diet with a lot of sugars, which is a very prominent factor for the development of the metabolic conditions that were mentioned in the studies. All of this puts the emphasis a lot more on endogenous erythritol, and it asks the question whether endogenous erythritol is a consequence of the diet and kind of accompanies the development of these diseases, or if it is involved in the development in some way of the diseases. As you can imagine, in these papers it was not distinguished between dietary erythritol and also erythritol that is produced in the body. It is important to mention that we do not ingest a lot of erythritol if we are just consuming it from fermented foods or fruits. Most of the erythritol that one would be ingesting would be with foods that are sweetened with the sweetener erythritol. And since we're talking about metabolic diseases, we have to move into the biggest controversy around erythritol, and that is its link to cardiovascular disease. All of this started with a paper that was published in 2023 that investigated a possible link between heightened erythritol concentrations in the blood and the incidence of major adverse cardiovascular events. So stroke would be one, for example. Human data was gathered from both US and European cohorts, so people from different sides of the world. But the thing with these people is that they were not the healthiest to begin with. These people were undergoing cardiac risk assessments, and a lot of them already had some pre-existing conditions such as type 2 diabetes or obesity. On top of all of that, the group in which this link was found was also the population group that was the oldest, which kind of makes all of the data and this entire paper a bit questionable in its credibility. This is why when I searched erythritol and then I searched the cardiovascular disease, one of the top searches was erythritol study debunked, and I believe that they meant the specific study in question, since there were so many variables that were not taken into question when the researchers made the conclusion here. Anyways, this paper then made a lot of headlines and inspired other researchers to investigate the issue. This is still a topic of research. In 2025, so this year, this specific study came out that was in vitro, so it was in cell lines. It investigated the impact of 30 grams of erythritol again on brain endothelial cells. This paper found that there was indeed a negative impact, an increase in oxidative stress and a decrease in nitric oxide production, and nitric oxide is quite important for endothelial function, so cardiovascular health overall. While this issue definitely deserves attention and further investigation. The original research, which raised the question in the first place, is quite questionable in the way they analyzed the data, and a lot of different variables were not really taken into account. There was actually a second paper that investigated this data again, but used a different type of analysis to exclude some of the variables. It was called, I believe, a Mendelian analysis, and this specific research paper found that there was no link between cardiovascular health risk and the consumption of erythritol. The European Food and Safety Authority also made a statement about this when talking about the laxative effects and providing this limit per day, and they concluded that the evidence that is provided does not really indicate that there is a link between the consumption of erythritol and the development of cardiovascular disease. My conclusion on erythritol would be, if you're consuming it in moderation and you're not overdoing it, but let's say you like the taste and you want to consume some type of sweetener with your coffee or anything, or with your tea maybe, then I don't believe that this could pose any threat to your cardiovascular risk, at least when looking at the data we have until now. All of the negative studies that became viral were actually not of the highest quality that they can be and have been largely debunked. There is more and more research going into this topic, and also comparing with the other sweeteners that I've discussed in the channel that have a lot more studies on their genotoxicity, and there's a conversation going on about cancer risk, etc., and also gut microbiome. All of this is not really present with erythritol. There is just no sufficient data and not any high quality data to suggest that you should throw away your packet of erythritol. Now let's move into a promising competitor, allulose. This is a rare sugar that is found naturally occurring in figs and raisins. It has some caloric value between 0 and 0.4 kilocalories per gram, but this would still be 10 times less than sugar if it was even in the highest level of 0.4 kilocalories per gram. It is a bit less absorbed compared to erythritol. Between 70 and 80% of the consumed allulose is uptaken in our small intestine, and then it again goes into the bloodstream, to our kidneys, and is excreted with the urine. The remaining percentage of allulose reaches our large intestine, but over there it cannot really be metabolized by the gut microbiome, and most of it leaves our system when you go and do a number 2. The thing with allulose is that our gut microbiome does not possess, fortunately for us, the enzyme called ALS-E to metabolize allulose and then ferment it. Therefore, allulose would not have any impact on the composition of our gut microbiome. The studies we have on allulose are not a lot, to be honest, but let's look at everything that we have. Allulose has no impact on blood sugar when consumed alone, which again is expected of a sweetener. This is why they were developed in the first place. What stands out a lot more is that research has shown that allulose has a positive impact on postprandial blood glucose levels. What postprandial means is that allulose was consumed, a meal was consumed, and then the blood sugar levels were measured. So this could lead to better glucose control after consuming a more carbohydrate-rich meal. Another promising finding is the impact of allulose on gut hormones, incretin hormones. This was actually from the same paper for erythritol, because this specific paper investigated the impact of both sweeteners on GLP-1, cholecystokinin, and peptide YY, and allulose also led to an increase in the levels of these hormones. Therefore, all of these three things make allulose pretty attractive for people who might be suffering from diabetes or insulin resistance, who also want to lose weight maybe because it has a low caloric value, and at the same time still leads to a release of satiety hormones. So if allulose looks pretty much too good to be true, then why the European Food and Safety Authority has not permitted it for use in the European Union? The EFSA made a statement in 2015 about allulose, and the conclusion was that there is generally just insufficient data. There were not even studies, negative studies, that were highlighted, and it was not said there needs to be more investigation into this specific topic, as it was with monk fruit. The areas where the data was lacking were most of the areas, and studies on genotoxicity were asked for, studies with more human data, and studies on the subchronic toxicity were also not provided, so that the EFSA can give the green light for allulose. I personally also was shocked that there was so little data out there on allulose. This is why this is going to be the shorter part of the video. I found only one toxicity test, and this was this 90-day oral toxicity test that was done on rats. And here the researchers wanted to define a no observed adverse effect level for allulose, and the level is 5,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which is 5 grams per kilogram body weight. Those are pretty extreme amounts, but I believe there were generally no observed effects in the rats in the study, so then this level was defined. I'm going to check again and put it on the screen if I'm wrong, but I think this is what the case was. And while the data that we have is very positive and promising, I'm going to repeat myself as I did with monk fruit. The data that we do not have, for me personally, is more concerning than the data that we already have. And for something that is permitted for use in a lot of products all around the world, the lack of studies investigating it is really shocking and surprising to me. So if you have chosen allulose as your sweetener, I am not really sure what advice I can give you. I personally wouldn't go for it. I mean, I can't buy it obviously because it's not permitted for use here, but the mystery around it is not very attractive for me. Now let's make a conclusion on natural sweeteners in general, not only these two, but also the ones I discussed in my previous video, stevia and monk fruit. Erythritol and stevia have been definitely more thoroughly investigated. This is why they're also permitted for use both in the European Union and also in the US. From the data that is out there, for stevia, the positive data, in my opinion, outweighs the negative one. There is always some negative data when you are really putting a lot of effort into researching something. Of course, something negative is going to come out at some point, and not every study design is the same, but the general picture around it is pretty positive. For erythritol, the studies that showed some negative implications are not of the highest quality, not with the best study design, and have been largely debunked. Of course, this topic deserves more investigation, but from the data that we have until now, if you're consuming in moderation erythritol or stevia, I do not believe that this can increase your health risk for anything. Unfortunately, for allulose and monk fruit, there is not really that much research out there. Now more and more is going to come out for sure, since they're pushing for permission in the European Union and possibly also in other countries. The data that is out there looks pretty promising, but there is just not enough of it. Or even in the case with monk fruit, the data that is out there has raised some questions that first need to be more thoroughly investigated to make an adequate conclusion. And I personally, if I was consuming a sweetener, maybe would have chosen stevia or erythritol. For the taste factor, I can't give you any advice, unfortunately, since I don't consume any type of sweetener. Some people just cannot stand stevia. This is completely up to you. And of course, I saw in the comment section of my previous video that some people suffer from headaches when they were consuming stevia. And if you're having any type of similar issue when consuming a sweetener or anything, to be honest, then of course you would stop consuming that and switch to something else. You have to figure out something that really works best for you and your body. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope that you enjoyed the contents of the video. Let me know down in the comments below if you have a topic you would like me to discuss next time. I have also linked my socials and my website in the description, and in my website I have some additional resources and even my own nutrition counseling services. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.